Well, hello everyone. Good morning, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from around the planet today. My name is Jesse. I'm here with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. And if you're joining us for the first time, like some of you are, we are all about bringing conservation, adventure, and science into classrooms around the world. Now, today's an exciting day. Later on, we've got Joanna Smart talking about epic ocean stuff. We've got Parks Canada and the mountain parks in Alberta talking about hoot and howl, cool creatures of the night. But we are kicking off in style all the way in Nagoya in Japan. It's only like our third Japanese broadcast ever with Kasia Majewski. She is going to talk to us today about a topic that I literally never thought we would feature in Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. A sentence I never thought I'd say, which is studying invasive raccoon dogs in Japan. I'm very excited. This is a creature that most people don't know. I am a lifelong aficionado of nature documentaries. And I can tell you, I've seen raccoon dogs like twice out of many thousands of hours of nature. So I'm very excited to dive in and learn more about these charismatic creatures. Kasia, thank you so much for joining us late at night, past your bedtime today, and for the delightful intro to the broadcast. And welcome back to the program.
Thank you so much, Jesse. I'm so glad to be back.
I need to tell our audience too. So the first time you joined us, which was 3 years ago, your topic was called Blizzards to Lizards, which is one of my favorite titles of all time. So again, as with all our programs, if you want to check out her last show, it's on our YouTube channel. This one will be on our YouTube channel. Basically, if you can't get enough of her, you have the opportunity to do that for years to come. So welcome in, and I'm going to stop talking. I'm talking too much already. You have a lot to share with us, and if you want to bring up your presentation, dive in, we can get underway.
You're absolutely right. I do have a lot to say. Like a lot of academics, oh boy, this is a topic that I could cover at length, but I've only got all of you for about 20-25 minutes. So let's dive right into studying invasive raccoon dogs in Japan. And right away with that title, I'm hoping that you've already got some questions flowing in your minds, because this is really a great opportunity for you to take advantage of my time, my undivided attention that I have for you today to answer your questions about what it's like studying invasive species, and in particular, this invasive species, raccoon dogs, in Japan. Now, I've tried to get into your minds and predict some of the questions that you might already have for me just based on that title. So here's the plan for today. The first question that I'm predicting you might have for me is, how do we know a species is invasive? Now, I'm guessing that lots of you are already familiar with the term invasive species and have some knowledge of what that is, but actually defining when a species has become invasive can be a bit complex. So we're going to dive into that first. The second question I bet you have for me probably is, what exactly is a raccoon dog? So I'm going to tell you all about that. And then I'm going to follow that up with why it's important to study invasive raccoon dogs. My fourth question that I think that you're going to have for me today, that I'm predicting, is where exactly we're studying them in Japan. So you might already know that actually raccoon dogs are native to the main islands of Japan. So it's a bit unusual that I'm here as part of a team studying invasive raccoon dogs here as well. And with that, I want to share with you a little bit of what it's like to be an invasive raccoon dog researcher here in Japan. And finally, I want to talk to you today about who can make a difference to the current and future state of species invasions around the world. This is actually a question that gets asked quite frequently whenever I do these kinds of talks. So it's something that I like to dive right into in the main body of my talk, because I have some important thoughts about this. And the final question that I predict you might have is actually just more questions about anything that has to do with any of these topics and beyond. And I'm going to try my best at the very end of this talk to address those for you in a way that is interesting and memorable. So, starting off with this first question, how do we know a species is invasive? So as I mentioned, you probably already have some sense of what an invasive species is. That's any species that's not native to a particular area. It was introduced there, and it is causing environmental and or economic harm. And these species, this is an important distinction, they can survive and thrive without human intervention. So even though they may have been introduced there by humans, they go on to exist without human support. They can outcompete. They are outcompeting native species, and fundamentally changing the structure of ecosystems or agricultural systems by being there. So examples of things that have been introduced as species but are not invasive species are things like ornamental species. So you might look out into your garden or playground or park around you, and you'll probably see a lot of plant species that were introduced there, that were planted there, that might originate from Asia or Europe or other parts of the world. Or if you're in Asia or Europe, they might have come from North America or South America. And these are plants that were planted there because they're pretty. They're there for aesthetic reasons. They might smell nice. They might look nice. They're part of the landscaping. But they are not going to outcompete the other species around them. They're just ornamental. They need human support to function. Similarly, you have agricultural species. So these are plants and animals that produce food, fibers, or other substances for human use. And they, again, rely on being tended to by humans, like this canola field that we see in the background in the photo. And we also have another category of animals that might be moved around the globe, and these are pets. So animals bred for human companionship. And many of these species, as I mentioned, they can't survive or thrive without human support, human intervention, and will not outcompete native species. So these are three other designations of introduced species that are not, they're introduced, but they're not invasive. You can also have non-native established species. So sometimes what happens is if you introduce a species like an ornamental flower, an agricultural plant or animal, or a pet species, you introduce it to a new environment, it escapes, it can find a way to survive without human support, human intervention. However, not to a point where they're outcompeting native species. Sometimes they just sort of integrate seemingly with the native ecosystem. And these we call in science and in biology, we call them non-native established species. So they're no longer, they started off maybe as an ornamental species, agricultural species, or a pet, but they've become established in a new region, but they're not seemingly not causing any harm. And this is actually a really tricky designation. So I specifically put European honeybees as the background here because there are often debates at this stage about whether these non-native established species are invasive, are causing harm or not. In European honeybees, there's actually a really fascinating debate raging about them in parts of North America. So European honeybees, the ones that we all recognize, they're part of the kind of Save the Bee, they're the main mascot for the Save the Bee campaigns that we see. They're actually not native to North America or many other parts of the world where they're introduced basically as livestock to act as pollinators. And in many parts of the world, they've become established. And in some parts of the world, entomologists, people who study insects, are saying that they're competing with other native bee species, other native pollinators for space and other resources. Whereas in other parts of the world where they have become established, people have not observed any negative impacts of European honeybees being a part of the ecosystem. They're just another pollinator, seemingly. So it's a real, to me, it's a very interesting debate that's going on. I used to actually keep bees in Ontario before I moved to Japan. So it's a very fascinating topic to me, something that you can check out as well if you're contemplating the thin line sometimes that exists between non-native established species and invasive species. But then, of course, when these species start to move, when we can really identify that these established species are starting to outcompete native plants and animals, and they prevent ecosystems from functioning normally, or they're causing economic damage, we define them then as invasive. And again, strategically, I've put red-eared sliders here because they're a great global example of a pet species that was introduced to waterways as a lot of people decided they no longer wanted to keep them as a pet after purchasing them at a pet store and release them into our waterways. And they are invasive in a lot of parts of the world now. So they rapidly went through being a pet to establishing themselves to becoming invasive and outcompeting lots of other native species, particularly native turtle species. So, as you've guessed from these definitions, humans continue to play a really important role in introducing species to new environments, whether it's intentional, so ornamental, agricultural, pet purposes, or even accidentally. So just through moving through an area, picking up seeds, accidentally transporting, insects or other wildlife from one part of the globe to the other. We are frequently moving species around the world, and it's causing some problems for us. So how do we know that a species has kind of breached that threshold, has moved from being established to being an invasive species causing harm? So I put together, it is not a comprehensive list, but a basic one, some signs that an introduced species has become invasive, and it's basically behavior that's acting to the detriment of native species. So number one, they might be competing for space. There's evidence that they're competing for space. This European starling is an excellent example in North America of an invasive species that now competes with native bird species for nesting sites, for cavities to nest in. So they're identified as invasive. Other types of competition for space might be looking at basking areas, feeding sites, that kind of thing. Invasive species also compete with native species for food, and they compete with native species also through predation. So they're either eating the food of the native species or they're eating the native species as their food, which is obviously detrimental to those populations. And these are just some of the direct ways that invasive species might impact native ecosystems, but there's lots of indirect impacts too. What do I mean when I say that? Well, so for example, when you have invasive animals being moved into, or plants being moved into a different location, along with them, there can be a bunch of hitchhikers in the form of parasites and diseases. And so they might be introducing parasites and diseases into new regions, or they might be increasing the spread of parasites and diseases in that area. And of course, that can negatively impact native wildlife as well as livestock and humans too. And interestingly, you can also have situations where seemingly invasive species are not impacting certain species in a way that we would normally think as negative. So they might actually be helping populations of certain species. We call this facilitation. So the presence of invasive species can make the environment more favorable for certain native or other invasive or non-native species. And this can change the ecosystem dynamic. So even by helping other species, they might be harming the balance of an environment. And it can also lead to a whole combination of these effects and what we call downstream effects or cascade effects. So this is like setting off a chain reaction. If you think about it, it could be an invasive species that's impacting one species, and that impact of that species impacts another species and another species, all the way down the line. And one of my favorite examples of this, a profound change that you might not expect, is with the introduction of the red fox, which you see pictured here, to Australia. They found that when red foxes were introduced to Australia, they spread rapidly, their population grew, and they were consuming a lot of the small mammals in parts of Australia. Without those small mammals, there was much less movement in the soil. There was much less seed dispersal as well, because that's what small mammals were doing. They were consuming and caching seeds, and they were churning up the soil. And as a result, there's large swaths of Australia, which were fundamentally changed. The plants, the vegetation fundamentally changed because these small mammals were removed, because these foxes that came in. And of course, the foxes were not consuming the vegetation directly. They were not impacting the vegetation directly. It was through their consumption of the small mammals that the entire landscape started to change. And you can imagine with that kind of change, how many more knock-on, how many more cascade effects you might have from that. So quantifying how much an invasive species is changing an ecosystem, how much it's impacting it, can be really, really difficult because the effects can be really broad. And not all ecosystems are as vulnerable to invasive species. Some are more vulnerable than others. So previous research has shown that island ecosystems that have evolved independently with a lot of endemic species, endemic means they are found only there, and have not evolved alongside strong pressures from things like predation. There might not be large predators on the island otherwise, or lots of parasites and diseases. When you introduce invasive species into these systems, they are disproportionately affected. They're more severely affected than other ecosystems. And so we see higher biodiversity loss on islands where invasive species have been introduced. And in particular, invasive mammalian predator species have been found to arguably be, and again, it is very difficult, I think, to quantify really the effects of each kind of invasive species. But there's several publications that refer to invasive mammalian predator species as arguably being the most damaging group of invasives to global biodiversity. And that's due to their adaptability. So how easily they're able to adapt to different habitats, how quickly they're able to spread, and due to their predation of birds, mammals, and reptile species, which are often endemic to places like island ecosystems. So a great example of that actually is pictured here, which is the feral house cat. Feral house cats are invasive all over the world, and they cause massive population decline in all three of those groups mentioned there: birds, mammals, and reptile species. So you have ecosystems that are particularly vulnerable, islands, and you have invasive species, a group of invasives that is particularly detrimental, invasive mammalian predators. One can see how if you mix those two together, you might have profoundly negative effects. Which brings us to this, which is, what is a raccoon dog? So you've already guessed from the title of my talk that raccoon dogs are invasive in some parts of the world. So let's talk about exactly what they are and how they fit into this scope of invasives. So their name, raccoon dog, is a little bit confusing because they're actually not raccoons and they're not common dogs. They are a canid, so from the dog family, but their closest relative is actually a fox. And if you're interested in scientific terminology and their scientific name, which I kind of am, I think it's interesting to note here that they're Nycterudes procyonoides. Nycterudes, that's their genus, and they're the only member of that genus. So they're kind of completely their own thing. They're a bit separate to the rest of the canids, and they have some really unusual traits among canids. So they're native to Asia and Eastern Russia originally, and they're considered nocturnal or crepuscular, which is the funnest word to say, meaning that they are active in early morning, dawn, and dusk as well. It depends on food availability when they're the most active, and they're highly adaptable. So they're found everywhere from subtropical climates to subarctic tundra. And they are omnivores or opportunistic carnivores, which means that they will eat anything, including meat, if it's on offer. So they, in gut contents and feces of raccoon dogs, they have found roots, berries, bark, insects, mollusks, eggs, reptiles, amphibians, fish, birds, small mammals, carrion, You name it, anything that looks like it might be food, they're going to eat it. Something unique about them, that's a bit unique among canids, is that they're monogamous each pairing season, and they have relatively large litter sizes compared to other canids. So on average, about 4 to 10 pups, with the record amount being 16 that was ever recorded. That was in Finland. They're very capable swimmers, with one study noting that an individual had no problem swimming up to 1.2 kilometers, which is really far. And weirdly, again, for canids, for dogs, they're latrine formers. What this means is that a group of them will all defecate in a defined area. So in one region where you find raccoon dogs, you might have several of these latrines, these toilets, where the adults and young will go, and that is where they will defecate. And actually, the purposes of these latrines, it's likely that they're used for communication between individuals, but what exactly they're communicating and how they're used is not entirely clear, has not been very well studied, which I find fascinating. And these latrines are also extremely useful for people like myself, for researchers of tanuki or raccoon dogs, because this species is typically very shy around humans. And this has also led to some problems with them, as they've been identified as invasive, because people don't tend to notice them in an area until the population has gotten very, very high, because they tend to just avoid people. So it's really through latrines very often that we can collect valuable information on things like their diet, any parasites or diseases or population. And it's all these different traits. So their adaptability, their large litter sizes, their sort of pupping success through their pairs, as both parents take care of the pups, all these factors contribute to making them highly successful in new habitats, and therefore excellent candidates for being an invasive species. So why is it important to study invasive raccoon dogs? And this is another common question that I often get. So, we know they might be invasive. We know invasives are bad, but why specifically study raccoon dogs? What is so bad about them? What is so important about them to study? Well, based on previous research, and there is quite a lot of it, we know that raccoon dogs can be really detrimental as invasive species. We know this because in parts of Europe, raccoon dogs have been invasive for quite some time. So you see that beautiful fur on the raccoon dog in this picture. That beautiful fur is what drove their initial introduction into a new part of Europe. So they were released in Western Russia from Eastern Russia. They were taken to Western Russia, Eastern and Northern Europe, all parts of the Soviet Union at that time, and just released for hunters to hunt for their fur and the initial introductions were during the 1940s and 1950s. And the raccoon dogs were so successful in this new habitat when they were brought over that by the 1980s, so about 40 years later, they had colonized over 1.4 million square kilometers across Europe. And of course, that estimate came from 40 years ago now, and we know that they have spread a lot since that time as well, and they continue to spread. So because of that, they have been identified as one of the 100 worst invasive species in Europe. And in certain countries like Poland, a recent estimate has placed them as being the most common carnivore species in the country, outnumbering the native carnivores. So extremely successful in these new habitats. And the impact of that invasion has been studied in these parts of Europe, primarily, it seems, through their impact on humans and livestock, due to their capacity for spread of parasites and diseases. But we still have a lot to learn about invasive raccoon dogs, and this is why it's so important to keep studying them, particularly when it comes to their impacts on native wildlife. So even though they've already been invasive, they were introduced into parts of Europe in the 1940s and 50s. It was only in 2019 that a study was released by Dahl Allen where they observed how much the capacity that raccoon dogs had for predating, for eating waterfowl eggs. And there's a really interesting paper that they published where they basically expressed that, you know, even in this one regard, predation of waterfowl eggs, you know, raccoon dogs might have had a really profound impact on waterfowl populations in parts where they're invasive that has just previously gone, you know, completely unrecorded. So we still have a lot to learn about exactly how they're impacting ecosystems. And even more so, as an invasive mammalian carnivore species, their impact on sensitive habitats like islands, this is poorly understood. And this really is where our research comes in. So the next question you might be wondering, like I mentioned previously, is where exactly are we studying invasive raccoon dogs in Japan? Because maybe you were already aware that raccoon dogs are native to the main islands here, as I mentioned. Oops, there we go. So tanuki, they're not just native here, they're beloved. In Japan, tanuki are this iconic symbol of myth and legend. They feature in a lot of old stories, and many people love them. They're often represented as you see here in these little figurines. These are basically a type of like Japanese garden gnome, and this symbol of this tanuki holding a little sake bottle with his little mischievous grin is usually placed in front of doorways or in gardens and is said to bring good luck. So they're culturally quite important here. But even though they're native to the main islands, they have made it to 2 reported islands, one in the Sea of Japan, which is Chiburijima in the Oki Island chain, and Yakushima, which is in southern Japan. And this is quite significant because both of these islands are protected by UNESCO. So Chiburijima is actually a geopark, and it has great cultural significance as well as geological significance. And Yakushima is actually a biosphere reserve, a UNESCO biosphere reserve. So both of these islands have great significance to Japan as well as the rest of the world. So we formed 2 projects, Okitan for the Oki Island tanuki and Yakutan for the Yakushima tanuki, to study the tanuki, the raccoon dogs of both these islands. Just for a bit of orientation, here's Japan, there's Chiburijima there, and here's Yakushima in the southern part of the island here. We started Yakutan in 2021 and Chiburijima just last year in 2023. And what has my life been like since we started? Well, let me give you a little bit of insight into that. This is just a quick whistle-stop tour of our research because we're actually doing quite a lot, which is great. So we've trialed some different types of methodology to try to assess the population of the tanuki on both of these islands. Because actually, currently, no one really knows what the population size or the different population densities across the islands is. So what we're trying to do is understand a little bit better about how the tanuki are using the space on these 2 islands and how many of them there are. So to do that, we've tried a couple of different techniques. The first one is live trapping in these box traps. So without harming the tanuki, we have tried to capture them, and we have tried to GPS color them. So that's the first method. Our second method that we have trialed in Chiburijima was using our drone-mounted infrared camera. So as far as we know, no one else has used this kind of infrared technology to physically count how many individuals are in a particular region. So we're hoping to try that out. And finally, one of my colleagues, Negin Islamabidgoli, is also studying the population genetics of the tanuki on Yakushima to try to get a better idea of how they might be related and how many individuals there might be in a region. The other element that we're studying, one of the other elements that we're studying, is also predation. So studying the diet of raccoon dogs. As I mentioned, they have this excellent latrine forming behavior, which is super useful for researchers like me. So you can see a tanuki utilizing a latrine there. And what I would do the next morning, as soon as possible, is I would go and collect these fresh fecal samples, fresh poop samples, and perform genetic analysis on them to study what kinds of species the tanuki have been eating. I'm particularly interested in rare, endangered, or endemic species. And for some more genetic type analysis, we're also looking at the parasites that tanuki have that can be present and identified in their feces. And furthering to that, we're also interested in how native species are interacting with latrines. So using camera traps, we've observed native deer, monkeys, small mammals, invertebrates interacting with latrines. And we're hoping to kind of quantify what kind of interactions they're having with those latrines in hopes of identifying behaviors that might be putting them at risk for things like parasite and disease transmission, as well as looking at species that actually might be benefiting from the locations of these latrines. So particularly species of dung beetles seem really drawn to these huge mounds of tanuki poop. Of course, it must just seem incredible to these beetles who would not naturally have such big reservoirs of food and egg-laying sites to suddenly have these big latrines that they can benefit from. So that's something else that we're really interested in, is the kinds of dung beetles that are utilizing these latrine sites, and if these latrine sites mean that, you know, certain beetle populations are being favored. And that's particularly interesting when you think about these other knock-on effects you might have, like these dung beetles having associated parasites in them as well. So more dung beetles might mean more parasites. That's something that we're investigating. In addition to that, I've also had the great fortune of working with Marie Gamaz, one of the members of our team, who recently started a behavioral analysis identifying raccoon dog behavior, which would indicate human, livestock, and raccoon dog conflict on Chiburijima. And in addition to that, she's also been running a public perception survey, so asking local people about their views of invasive tanuki, trying to understand any community human tanuki conflict on Chiburijima, if people perceive them as agents of conflict, or if they think they're now an iconic species that belong to the island, they want to keep them there, or if they think they're irrelevant altogether. And understanding how people view invasive species is critical for building a foundation if you want to pursue public outreach and education, which is really important for then carrying out different policies for management. So if you want people to care about the impacts invasive species are having on native ecosystems, it's important to share, to understand what people know about the impacts that they're having already, and then build an educational program from that to get everyone on board and ideally working together for the same common goal. And with that, you might be asking, well, who exactly in the community can make a difference to species invasions? This is a massive global problem. There's all these invasive species affecting ecosystems all over the planet. Is it policymakers, communities, individuals? Who really can make a difference? And this is where I can really insert my personal opinion, what I would really like to share with you from my experiences. I want to reiterate first that it's humans as a whole, broadly, that are responsible for so many invasive species introductions, including, even on this level, the raccoon dogs to Chiburijima, and we think probably Yakushima as well, although that's not confirmed. Humans are so often responsible for species introductions, whether on purpose or by accident. And I think by better understanding our role in ecosystems, we can start to behave in a more informed way to prevent the spread and introduction of new invasive species. So we can all make a difference through our actions, but also, and this is very important, through our words and how we talk about species invasions. So I'm often asked what people can do. Like often when people think about species invasions and how dire the situation is, they want to know how they can act now. And my personal opinion is that it can start and should start with something as small but profound as the language that we use when we talk about invasive species. So specifically, maybe many of you, as you've been watching this presentation, contemplating tanuki, you might have considered them to be cute. They are charismatic. There is a reason why they're so beloved by people in their native range, like here in Japan, because they have a charisma. But placing this cuteness, this charisma above our responsibility to ecosystems can continue to damage these ecosystems. It can block policy from being formed. It's a kind of protection for these animals as they continue to damage the ecosystems that they're in. So I think it's important to remain responsible and consider our roles as environmental stewards, the responsibility we have to the ecosystems of our planet and keeping them safe. And it can start by being mindful of how you discuss and view, especially charismatic invasive species. So if you stop seeing them as cute and charismatic and you see them as another species that can be important to their native ecosystems, but damaging to ones when they are introduced, it helps to prevent the spread, the geographic spread through the pet trade, which is actually a major issue for tanuki. A lot of people are buying them as pets or want them as pets. And also, they have some popularity on social media as pets or non-native species as they're being spread around the globe. And this is particularly actually worrying in North America, where people want to keep them as pets. So if I can leave you with one message here for how you can start making a difference today after watching this talk, it is thinking about the language that you use and make sure that you're choosing conservation messaging over charisma of species. So that's the conclusion of my talk today. I want to thank you all so very much. And I just wanted to say also that my research would not have been possible without financial support from the Explorers Club, the UNESCO, Oki UNESCO Global Geopark, Kyoto University, my university, and Mont Bell. So I just wanted to thank all of those people as well and institutions as well. And now it's up to you. Have you got more questions for me? You can send them my way. Now's your chance.
Lovely. Well, thank you so much, Kasia. And we're going to dive into a quick little question period because I know it's nearing the end of the period for some of our classes. One of our first ones was, when you're in the field, are there any dangers to you? Are there any creatures that you need to worry about when you're going around in Japan, or is it otherwise pretty safe?
So field work always has some element of danger. I think you need to be mindful and you have to be responsible anytime that you're in the outdoors. Here in Japan, compared to some other habitats that I've worked in, which if you're interested about that, you're welcome to view my previous talk on exploring by the seat of your pants and my work in Borneo. Japan, by comparison, the number of predatory species or venomous species is far fewer than in other tropical parts of the world, but I still have to be careful about venomous snakes. There's a viper species in my field site, and hornets are also a concern. and just generally exposure to the elements. That's always something that you have to be wary of when you're working outdoors.
Yeah. I didn't know there were any vipers in Japan. How about that? I'm a snake guy, so there you go. News to me. Quick funny question about their fur. How soft is their fur? Do you know?
I do know because we did some trapping, like you saw a picture of a trapped tanuki there. So we were able to handle an anesthetized individual. And I've also handled tanuki pelts. It's very, very soft. It's like, I would put it almost similar to something like chinchilla fur. It's really, really thick. It has a thick undercoat. You can see exactly how they manage to adapt to, subarctic conditions. And actually, one thing I can't puzzle out with how soft and thick their fur is how are they surviving in subtropical climates? It just seems crazy to me to be wearing that kind of fur coat in 35 degrees Celsius weather. It's nuts.
Do we, this is just a follow-up for me, actually. Do we know if maybe in that diversity of range, the ones that are more subtropical have thinner fur, or is there any evidence of that, or is anyone even looking into that at all, or no?
I don't know. I've not stumbled across that in my readings, so I'm not sure if there's a difference in fur.
New project. There we are.
Postdoc.
Yeah, the latrines was interesting. Are there any other animals that do anything like that, or is that fairly unique, or what's the deal?
Yeah, actually, I'd love to come back and do a whole talk on latrines because it's a really fascinating sort of subject. There are other species that form latrines. Actually, raccoons form latrines as well. And in parts of Japan, there's also invasive raccoons, but native raccoon dogs. And it can be confusing because I guess their latrines look similar. So I'm lucky I don't have that problem where I have to tell between them. But yeah, there's actually quite a few species that are latrine forming, although there's also debate about what is a true latrine, because there's some species that form latrines under certain situations. For example, some weasel species, when they have little baby weasels, they'll all have a latrine, like a familial latrine in one place when they're sharing a den all together, but then they don't have a latrine behavior outside of that. So are they latrine forming or not? There's a bit of a debate about that.
The old latrine or not challenge. Not something we talk about very often here. Time flies and you're having fun, so we're nearing the end of the broadcast. Is there any final message you want to share with us? Any favorite part of the work that you do that you want to leave us with today?
Yes, actually, of course there is. So at the very end, I really wanted to make a point of thanking all the people that supported this work. But I also want to take a minute now to thank the communities here that have supported the work that we're doing. And if I can impart any final messages to any aspiring field biologists, anyone who wants to work in science, I would say that make sure that you find that community that you can feel a part of and that you can contribute to, because the work is obviously very difficult, very challenging. And when the work gets challenging, when it's rainy, you've got a backpack full of poop samples and you're just wondering what the heck you're doing. It's that community and what they mean to you and what your research means to them that will pull you through it. So that's the final message I'd like to share with you today.
That's a beautiful message and applies to pretty much every program that we do. So a big thank you for that, and for the line, backpack full of poop samples, that you do not hear every day, except here on Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. So Kasia, thank you so much to our audience at home. Thank you for joining today. Check out her last program on our YouTube channel. Share this with your family and friends, and get to Japan someday, because it seems like a pretty spectacular spot. Have a wonderful day, everyone. We'll let you get to bed, Kasia, and we'll say bye.